Am I overdependent on my little brother? So recently, I found out that I had failed university. The weight of those words was crushing. Not I might fail, not there's a chance I won't make it, but an official notice that confirmed the worst. I hadn't just stumbled or hit a rough patch, I had fallen off the academic cliff entirely. Academic exclusion. Those words felt like a death sentence, like someone had stamped failure across my entire existence. I couldn't even bring myself to read the email twice. The first time was enough to sear it into my mind, a scar I'd carry forever. At first, I sat in stunned silence, staring at the screen. The world outside my window kept turning, cars driving by, kids playing down the street, neighbors chatting about mundane things. But inside, my world had stopped. Everything froze in that moment. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow, and my thoughts spiraled uncontrollably. How had I let this happen? How could I have been so lazy, so short-sighted? There were no medical issues to blame, no tragic backstory that would explain my downfall. It was me. It was all me. My lack of discipline. My inability to see the bigger picture. My failure. Shame washed over me in waves. I thought about my classmates who were probably celebrating their victories, their hard work paying off. I thought about my parents, who had once been so proud of me. And I thought about myself, the version of me who used to dream of a future filled with success, achievement, and fulfillment. That person felt like a distant memory, a ghost of someone I no longer was. The worst part? I couldn't even muster the strength to cry. I just sat there, numb. I told myself, this is it. You've ruined your life. Dramatic? Maybe. But in that moment, it felt true. I had built my entire identity around being the smart one, the one who had a future ahead of them. And now I was the dropout. The failure. The disappointment. The thought of telling my parents made me feel physically ill. I imagined their faces, the confusion, the disappointment, the heartbreak. What would they say? What would they think of me? For days, I avoided them as much as I could. I couldn't bear to see their faces, knowing that the truth was hanging over my head like a dark cloud. The guilt ate away at me, and soon, it morphed into something darker. A small, insidious voice in my head whispered, "You're worthless. You've always been worthless." It reminded me of every time I had procrastinated, every assignment I had skipped, every opportunity I had let slip through my fingers. What's the point of going on if you are just going to fail at everything? The voice was relentless, and soon, the darkness felt all-consuming. I reached a point where I genuinely considered ending it all. The thought crossed my mind more than once. It wasn't a fleeting feeling of hopelessness, it was a deep, suffocating despair. I sat on the floor of my room, staring at nothing in particular, wondering if anyone would miss me. Wondering if my absence would even matter. Would the world be better off without me? But I couldn't do it. Something inside me, some small, fragile part of me refused to let go. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was stubbornness. Or maybe it was hope, buried deep beneath the layers of self-loathing. Whatever it was, it kept me here. Kept me breathing, even when I didn't want to. Instead of giving in to that darkness, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I made a plan. It wasn't a grand, elaborate plan. It wasn't a detailed roadmap to success. It was simple, and it was about survival. Step 1, tell my parents. The thought made my stomach churn, but I knew I couldn't keep avoiding it forever. They deserved to know. And maybe, just maybe, they'd help me figure out what to do next. It took me a month to work up the courage. 30 days of rehearsing the conversation in my head, over and over again. I imagined every possible reaction, from disappointment to anger to complete indifference. But nothing could have prepared me for how it actually went. When I finally sat them down and told them the truth, I braced myself for the worst. I expected raised voices, maybe even tears. Instead, they sat there quietly, absorbing my words. There was no shouting, no accusations, just quiet understanding. My dad was the first to speak. His voice was calm, steady. "It's okay," he said. "We'll figure this out." Those words hit me like a tidal wave. It's okay? How could it be okay? I had failed. I had let them down. But he meant it. I could see it in his eyes. There was no anger, no disappointment, just concern and love. My mom reached out and took my hand. "We've always been proud of you," she said softly. "And we still are." I broke down then. The tears I had been holding back for weeks finally spilled over. They weren't angry. They weren't ashamed. They still loved me, even after everything. It was a lifeline I hadn't realized I desperately needed. But as grateful as I was for their support, the person who surprised me the most was my little brother. Growing up, my brother and I had a typical sibling relationship filled with teasing, inside jokes, and the occasional argument. We weren't particularly close, but there was always an unspoken bond between us. I never thought of him as someone I could lean on. He was younger, after all. I was supposed to be the one looking out for him, not the other way around. But in the days following my confession, he stepped up in ways I never expected. It started with small things. He'd check in on me more often, ask how I was feeling. He didn't pry or push me to talk about things I wasn't ready to share. He was just there. And in those quiet moments of support, I realized how much I had underestimated him. One evening, he knocked on my door, something he rarely did. I looked up from my bed, surprised. "What's up?" I asked. He shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. "Just checking in." I smiled, though it was small and tired. "Thanks." There was a pause, then he added, "You're not a failure, you know." His words caught me off guard. I had been so consumed by my own self-loathing that I hadn't considered how he saw me. To him, I wasn't just the sibling who had messed up. I was still his older sister. Still someone he looked up to, even if I couldn't see it. In that moment, something shifted. Maybe my life wasn't over. Maybe I hadn't ruined everything. There was still time to turn things around. Still people who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. And that realization, that tiny glimmer of hope, was enough to keep me going. I've always been insecure. I can't remember a time when I wasn't. Even as a kid, I constantly compared myself to others, their looks, their achievements, the way they carried themselves with confidence that I could never seem to grasp. It didn't matter what I accomplished. There was always that nagging voice in my head, whispering that it wasn't enough. "You're not enough. You will never be enough." That voice grew louder as I got older. In school, I did well on tests, but I never really felt smart. I felt like a fraud, like I was just lucky. When I made friends, I always wondered why they liked me, constantly worrying that one day they'd realize I wasn't worth their time and leave. It's exhausting, living with that voice, a constant shadow that looms over everything you do. It's like trying to outrun a storm cloud, only to realize it's always right above you. University was supposed to be my fresh start. A chance to prove myself, to finally silence that voice. I thought that if I could succeed there, I'd finally feel like I belonged, like I was capable. But instead, I proved the voice right. I failed. And when I failed, that voice became deafening. I convinced myself that everyone would see me the same way I saw myself, a disappointment, a failure. The shame was unbearable. I didn't want anyone to know. Not my friends, not even the people who had been closest to me. So, I did what I've always done when things get hard, I withdrew. It started slowly. I stopped replying to texts, making excuses when people wanted to hang out. "I'm busy," I'd say, or, "I've got a lot on my plate right now." At first, they believed me. But as weeks turned into months, the messages stopped coming. The invites dried up. Eventually, the only people left in my life were my parents, my work colleagues, and one internet friend who knew everything, even the darkest parts of my story. I didn't plan to tell them about my almost KMS incident. But when you've got no one else to talk to, you open up in unexpected ways. It happened late one night, during one of our usual chats. I was feeling particularly low, and I just blurted it out. I expected shock, maybe even judgment. But instead, they responded with compassion. "I'm glad you're still here," they said. Those words hit me harder than I expected. I'm glad you're still here. No one had ever said that to me before. It was such a simple sentiment, but in that moment, it felt monumental. Someone cared. Someone, out there in the vastness of the internet, was glad that I existed. That friendship became a lifeline. We'd talk about everything: my struggles, their struggles, random things to distract ourselves from reality. They never made me feel like a burden. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was one. I worried that I was too much, even for them. The thing is, I've always had a tendency to overthink my relationships. Am I annoying them? Do they secretly wish I'd leave them alone? Those thoughts spiral, feeding my insecurity and making it even harder to reach out to people. It's a vicious cycle: feeling lonely but pushing people away because you are terrified of being rejected. At work, it's easier to put on a mask. I smile, I joke with my colleagues, and I get through the day. But it's all surface level. They don't know the real me. They don't know the mess I've become. And I prefer it that way. The idea of them finding out terrifies me. I imagine their pitying looks, their whispered conversations behind my back. "Did you hear? She failed out of university." I can't handle that. So, I keep them at arm's length. At home, it's different. My parents know the truth. They've been incredibly supportive, more than I ever expected. But their parents, they love me unconditionally, even when I don't feel I deserve it. I know they worry about me, they try not to show it, but I can see it in the way they look at me, in the little things they do to make my life easier. But it's my little brother who's been the biggest surprise. We've never been particularly close. He's younger than me by a few years, and we've always had that typical sibling dynamic: teasing, bickering, but never too deep. I've always thought of him as the annoying little brother, someone I'd protect but never confide in. Yet, in the wake of my failure, he's been there in ways I never expected. At first, it was subtle. He'd pop his head into my room more often, asking if I wanted to watch something with him or if I needed anything from the kitchen. Little gestures that, at the time, I didn't fully appreciate. But as I pulled further away from the outside world, he became my anchor. There was one night when I was particularly low, the kind of low where even getting out of bed felt impossible. I hadn't eaten all day, too consumed by my thoughts to care about basic needs. My door creaked open, and there he was, holding a plate of food. "Mom said you haven't eaten," he said, setting the plate down on my desk. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. He didn't say anything else, just sat on the edge of my bed, scrolling through his phone. It was such a simple act, but it meant everything. He didn't ask questions. He didn't push me to talk. He was just there. That's the thing about my brother: he has this quiet way of showing he cares. He doesn't express his feelings openly, but his actions speak volumes. Still, I can't help but wonder if I'm too much for him, too. I've become so dependent on his presence, on those small moments of connection. Am I leaning on him too hard? Am I suffocating him with my need for validation? The thoughts creep in, making me second-guess every interaction. It's been months since I've spoken to my friends. The guilt of cutting them off weighs heavily on me. I know I should reach out, explain what happened, but I can't bring myself to do it. What if they've moved on? What if they don't want to hear from me? The thought of rejection paralyzes me. I keep telling myself that I'll reconnect with them once I've sorted out my life. Once I have something to show for myself, a job, a plan, anything that proves I'm not a complete failure. But deep down, I know that's just an excuse. There's never going to be a perfect time. There's never going to be a moment when I feel fixed. And so, I stay in this limbo, caught between wanting connection and fearing it. The only person who truly knows everything is my internet friend. They've seen the darkest parts of me, the moments when I've been at my lowest. And they're still here. That friendship is a lifeline, a reminder that I'm not completely alone. But even that comes with its own set of insecurities. What if I'm too much for them, too? What if one day they decide they've had enough? It's exhausting, living in a constant state of self-doubt. But it's all I know. It's who I've always been. And yet, despite all of this, I'm still here. I'm still trying. Maybe that's enough for now. Usually, I speak to my brother for maybe 5 minutes a day, 10 if he's in a good mood and lets me ramble about whatever random thought I've latched onto that day. Our conversations are short, surface level, and often punctuated with playful insults. It's just the way we've always been. He finds me pretty annoying. I know that. I'm the older sibling who knocks on his door just to say hi or to tease him in that sibling way we've done all our lives. Sometimes it's a light-hearted insult, other times, I just stand there, waiting for a reaction, hoping he'll engage. It's not that I don't know how annoying I can be, it's that I don't know how else to connect. When I was younger, I never worried about whether I was annoying. Back then, being a big sister felt simpler. I was the bossy one, the responsible one, the one who'd look out for him no matter what. But things change. We grow up. And somewhere along the way, I lost that effortless connection we once had. Now, every interaction feels like a delicate balancing act. Am I being too much? Too intrusive? Too needy? Lately, I've been craving that connection more than ever. I guess it's because he's one of the few people left in my life who still feels familiar, still feels real. My friends are gone, my social life is non-existent, and my world has shrunk to the size of my house. My brother, even when he's rolling his eyes at me or telling me to get out of his room, is a constant. And right now, I'm clinging to constants. A few months ago, we played Uno together. It was one of those rare moments when we both had time to kill and nothing better to do. It wasn't anything special, just a simple card game. But for me, it stood out. It wasn't about the game itself, it was about spending time with someone, feeling that connection, even if only for a little while. After that, I kept hoping we'd play again. But time passed, and it never happened. Life got in the way, or maybe it was just that I never asked. So one day, out of the blue, I decided to bring it up. "You never play Uno with me anymore," I complained, half joking, half serious. He shrugged, barely looking up from his phone. "You never ask." That caught me off guard. I never ask. I thought about it for a moment, and maybe he was right. I'd been waiting for him to suggest it, to take the initiative. But maybe he was waiting for me, too. "So, if I ask, would you play?" I ventured cautiously. He glanced at me, and for a moment, I saw the flicker of a smile. Yet. That one word lit a spark of hope in me. Yet. It was a simple answer, but it meant more to me than I think he realized. He didn't hate spending time with me. He wasn't completely closed off. All I had to do was ask. So, I did. For the next 3 days, I made a point of asking him to play Uno. Every time I asked, he had a reason to put it off. 30 minutes from now. Maybe tomorrow. I tried to be patient. I told myself he was busy, that he'd make time when he could. But the truth was, I was getting more and more anxious. Each rejection felt like a tiny sting, A reminder that maybe I was asking too much. By the third day, I couldn't take it anymore. It was getting late, and I hadn't heard from him all evening. I knocked on his door, peeking my head in. "Hey," I said softly. "Are we gonna play?" He barely glanced at me, focused on his PS5. His headset was on, his friends' voices filtering through the speakers. Without looking up, he said, "Yeah, I'm not playing." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'm not playing. Just like that, he dismissed me. No apology, no explanation. Just a casual rejection, like it didn't matter. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of it sink in. My chest tightened, and I bit the inside of my cheek to keep the emotions at bay. I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to be that annoying sibling who couldn't take a hint. "Oh," I said quietly. "Okay." He didn't even acknowledge me. He just went back to his game, laughing with his friends like I wasn't even there. I closed the door behind me and went back to my room, feeling that familiar ache in my chest. Why did he tell me to ask if he was never going to say yes? Why give me hope, only to snatch it away? I sat on my bed, replaying the interaction in my mind, picking apart every word, every gesture. Was I being too much? Too clingy? I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe he was right, maybe I only annoyed him because I had no one else. Maybe I was desperate for connection, and it was starting to show. I thought back to a recent argument we'd had. It was one of those sibling spats that start over something silly and escalate into something deeper. "You only bother me because you have no friends," he had snapped. The words stung more than I cared to admit because there was truth in them. I didn't have friends. I'd cut everyone off, and now I was clinging to him because he was the only one left. I tried to brush it off at the time, but it lingered in the back of my mind. And now, sitting alone in my room, it resurfaced with a vengeance. Was I being too much? Was I pushing him away with my neediness? I wanted to believe that he cared. I wanted to believe that our sibling bond was stronger than that. But the doubts were creeping in, whispering that I was a burden, that I was suffocating him with my presence. The thing is, I didn't want much. I wasn't asking for grand gestures or deep conversations. I just wanted to play Uno. I just wanted a few moments of connection, a break from the loneliness that had become my constant companion. But maybe even that was too much to ask. I tried to distract myself, scrolling through my phone aimlessly, but my mind kept drifting back to the rejection. I thought about messaging my internet friend, but I stopped myself. They already knew too much. I didn't want to burden them with another tale of rejection. Instead, I sat in silence, feeling the ache in my chest grow heavier. The loneliness was suffocating. I thought about knocking on his door again, apologizing for being annoying, for asking too much. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. He'd still be playing his game, still laughing with his friends, still living in a world where I didn't quite fit. And that was the hardest part, knowing that he had a world outside of me, while I had no one outside of him. I lay back on my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it didn't matter. It's just It's just a game. It's not a big deal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about the game. It was about connection. About feeling seen and valued. About not feeling so alone. I closed my eyes, trying to push the thoughts away, but they lingered, echoing in my mind. Am I too much? Am I pushing everyone away? And the scariest thought of all, will I ever stop feeling this lonely? After he turned me down that night, I couldn't shake the sadness. It wasn't just about Uno. It was the feeling of rejection, the confirmation of what I had feared for a long time, that I was too much, too needy, too dependent on others for the connection I so desperately craved. I tried to tell myself that it wasn't a big deal. People say no all the time, right? But this wasn't just a casual no. This felt personal. It felt like a reminder that I was alone, that I had made myself alone. I thought back to that argument we had not too long ago, when my brother snapped at me in frustration. "You only annoy me because you have no friends," he had said. And he wasn't wrong. I had isolated myself. I'd pulled away from everyone who once mattered to me, ashamed of my failures, afraid of being judged. I cut off my friends before they could cut me off. It was self-preservation in the worst way. But in doing that, I left myself with no one. No one except him. I sat on my bed, replaying the argument in my head, the sting of those words still fresh. Was I really annoying him because I had no one else to talk to? Was I putting too much pressure on him to fill a void that wasn't his responsibility to fill? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I leaned on him. Every time I felt lonely, every time I needed a distraction from my thoughts, I went to him. I knocked on his door, made jokes, tried to spark a conversation not because he was the only person I wanted to talk to, but because he was the only person left. And it wasn't fair to him. I thought about all the ways I tried to make it up to him, to be a good older sister. Buying him snacks. Giving him part of my paycheck every month, £50 I could barely spare. Trying to be patient with him, even when he was moody or dismissive. But it never felt like enough. No matter how much I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was failing in this role, too. I didn't want to admit it, but I was looking for validation in all the wrong places. I wanted to feel needed, important. I wanted to feel like I mattered to someone. And when my brother turned me down, when he dismissed me with a shrug and went back to his PS5, it felt like confirmation that I didn't. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of my emotions. The sadness, the loneliness, the overwhelming feeling of being too much, it all felt so heavy. Why was I so desperate for connection? Why couldn't I just be okay on my own? The answer was simple, even if I didn't want to admit it. I was lonely. Deeply, painfully lonely. And loneliness does strange things to a person. It makes you overthink every interaction, cling to every small moment of connection, and spiral when that connection doesn't come. But as I sat there, lost in my thoughts, something shifted in me. I didn't want to be a burden anymore. I didn't want to rely on my brother to fill the gaps left by my own insecurities and isolation. It wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't healthy for me. I realized that I needed to make a change, not for him, but for myself. The next day, I woke up with a sense of clarity. I couldn't undo the past. I couldn't magically repair my friendships or erase the shame I felt from failing university. But what I could do was take small steps forward. I could start rebuilding my life, piece by piece. I decided to reach out to one of my old friends, someone I hadn't spoken to in months. It was terrifying. My hands shook as I typed out the message, my mind racing with thoughts of rejection. But I hit send anyway. "Hey. I know it's been a while, and I'm sorry for disappearing. Things have been hard. I'd love to catch up, if you're up for it." I stared at the screen, heart pounding, waiting for a reply. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I tried not to check my phone obsessively, but it was hard. Every time it buzzed, my stomach twisted with anticipation. Finally, a reply came through. "Hey. I've been thinking about you. I'd love to catch up. How about coffee next week?" Relief washed over me, followed by a mix of emotions I couldn't quite place. It wasn't too late. I hadn't ruined everything. There were still people who cared, still connections to be made. That night, I knocked on my brother's door again. "What now?" he asked, half annoyed, half amused. "I just wanted to say thanks," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "For putting up with me." He raised an eyebrow. "What are you on about?" "I know I can be annoying," I admitted. "And I know I've been, a lot lately. I'm working on it." For a moment, he just stared at me, like he wasn't sure what to make of my sudden sincerity. Then he shrugged, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "You're not that bad," he said. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was his way of saying he cared, even if he'd never say it outright. As I walked back to my room, I felt lighter. Things weren't perfect, far from it. But I was starting to see a way forward. A way to reconnect, to rebuild, to find myself again. And maybe, just maybe, I'd get him to play Uno one day. For now, that was enough.